Good afternoon. I'm Ann Lindsley, and I'm from Beller High School in Houston, Texas, and I am here to help you with the AP Human Geography curriculum for the rest of this semester. My colleague, Kristen Brandt, will be joining us tomorrow as she will address one of the other topics. So between the two of us, we are here to help you get through the rest of this course. I would like to begin with But I would like to let you also know that one of the goals of College Board is to go ahead and teach portions of the remaining content so that you can be prepared, not just for finishing out this, but also because the colleges are supporting AP students this year by allowing more flexibility in our approach to the exam. They're allowing us to focus on less content on the exams because of the school issues that have occurred. But in turn, they've asked that AP students continue to learn today's material and some other portions that still remain to be taught. To make this relevant to our upcoming exam, however, I will be including areas that specifically link to previous units. And I'm going to point that out throughout the time, as well as Kristen will do that, Ms. Brandt will do that in the next coming days. So there is some very much value for looking at cities and urban land use patterns, and then the next unit is development, because there are parts of these that link to our previous units, and we definitely will indicate that for you. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're looking at Unit 6, Cities and Urban Land Use Patterns and Processes. Our very first topic is 6.1, the origin and influences of urbanization. If we move on to a warm-up practice, we want to begin with looking at this big idea of patterns and spatial organization. Now, patterns and spatial organization is an overarching theme through all of our units, but when we're looking at the urban unit in particular, we're looking at the growth of cities and how the growth of cities is based upon the physical geography, what available resources there are, what the population is able to do with that particular environment. And then we also are incorporating our skill levels, and one of our skill levels that applies to this particular section of the unit is geographic patterns and relationships of those patterns applied in certain contexts. So keeping that in mind, let's look at this picture. You probably all have seen this picture before. This is North America at night, all the lights shining. But I want you to look at this in a different perspective. Instead of trying to identify certain cities and things like that, I want you to look for patterns. What kind of patterns do you see? What kind of connection to cities? Do you see obvious connections? Can you make out what might be smaller towns and your imagination may be linked together by roads, and you concentration of the street lights? If we look right through here, I-35 coming through Texas. Then we can also see I-10 stretching from San Antonio, Houston, all the way over to Florida. We can see the coastal highway of the West Coast. We see the connections of the megalopolis on the East Coast, Boston to Washington, megalopolis, Boswash corridor. So do places appear in isolation? Even these in the Western United States, Denver, Salt Lake City, do they appear to be completely isolated? Is that a pattern that they create out there? Or do you think places have relationships? We want to look at these kinds of relationships and what cultivates these relationships through the perspective of the previous units that we've already covered. So then we have to ask ourselves, what is the reason for the location of these places? Why do we have this kind of pattern where we have a distinctive line through almost the middle of the United States, where we have spots of places, but not as much fill-in as we have in the Eastern United States? So I want you to think about patterns as a skill level as we start to pull apart some of these urban topics. And we're only going to be looking at 3 topics, not the entire unit, but these 3 topics back into previous units again. So in this particular lesson, I want you to begin to think about the concept of site situation. Our very first essential knowledge deals with site situation and the influence, the origin and the function and the growth of cities. So I want to begin with thinking about what we see. So here we're looking at the site. We see this place. We're not really sure where it is. This is taken from space. What does this terrain look like to you? Is this a tropical rainforest? Could this be a desert? Could this be a flood channel? What do you see here? What do you think you see here? Do you see water? Are there roads connecting places? Do you see anything that might look like agriculture? Why would this become now one of the largest cities in this particular region? What do you see at this site? Why did 2.5 million people settle here? If we go to the concept of situation, we begin to look at what makes this area unique. Where is this place in relation to other places? 2,000 years ago, what was this area? This area is 50 kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea. It sits on water, not the Mediterranean, it sits on a river. Will there be roads connected near it? Or are there roads that already exist? Not all roads are concrete, be careful. So when we look at another image of this particular site, we have to ask, well, why did they pick this site in one of these historic renderings of this place? Well, one of the reasons is because this area was protected by the anti-Lebanon mountains, but yet it was also fed by the Barada River. So it was surrounded by irrigated farmland, which would provide vegetables and cereals and fruits for the population to settle here. So we're looking at this place and we can begin to evaluate this particular site not only has protection, but this site also provides for sustenance, agriculture, the ability to raise sedentary agricultural crops so that people can eventually do other things, beginning to lead to development. A place also will eventually have a cultural influence. This particular place in 715 of the Common Era has one of the most historic mosques in the world that was constructed here. And actually this place was built within a fortress wall, which you don't see in this particular image. But the walls are going to provide a sense of security for this place as the population puts their footprint or their cultural footprint on the landscape. And that is something you should have heard in the cultural unit. If we continue on to look at this particular place, we look at a regional influence. Did this place develop as a hub for the entire region? Yes, it did, because actually when you figure out the name of this place, it's probably one of the only ones that you have regularly heard of. But this city became an anchor for this entire region because it did sit at the regional crossroads of going east to west and north to south trade routes. If we look at this place today, we see a huge growth in its urban influence all the way out from the central area where the mosque originally was built to the suburban areas. So we begin to ask, well, how does the site and situation continue to influence the growth of the longest continually inhabited city in the world? Think about that. Today, this place is home to 2.5 million people. It's the capital. It's the largest city in this region. In 2008, it was the Arab capital of culture. So it definitely has a cultural footprint in the region as well. But today, unfortunately, it is also the least livable city, according to some statistics. Anyone guess what the city is? The city is Damascus. And by looking at various images of it, we have to begin to ask these questions. Site and situation being the fundamental questions. Why? What is here? How do we know the why of where this place is? We have to look at the attributes of the place. Because when we start to look at the attributes of the place, then we start to draw upon previously learned information, our cultural, our population unit, our agricultural units. So moving on, what do we need to know? Well, we are looking at the function and the origin of places, of certain cities. So if we take the purpose of the site, we look at site as a function for the development of a city. We begin to go back to its origins, and in its origins, most likely has one of these 5 characteristics. It could be a break of bulk point. Do you have trade and transportation? Does large amounts of cargo come in and get broken down by truck, by air, by ship, even by rail? Now keep in mind, we could go back 10,000, 8,000 years in history. If we go back well into the beginnings of the origin of Damascus, this particular location was a break of bulk place because it was a point where 2 crossroads of trade stopped. And so you begin with the periodic market and breaking down large amounts of goods and trading them there. And out of that, then a place begins to grow. So we call this a break of bulk point. Does a place begin as a head of navigation? Head of navigation, the furthest inland an ocean-going vessel can get to. This is one of my places. This is my only place. This is Houston. And that is actually the founding reasons for the city of Houston itself. How far inland could an ocean-going vessel get away from the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico? And so you see the ship channel region and then the city in the back, which is actually where ocean-going vessels, smaller ones, used to be able to get. Does a place begin as an entrepot? An entrepot. An entrepot, this is a vocabulary word. This is unique to urban topics, but that's not the. What's happening here as an entrepot is that we are breaking down imports and exports. And that's what you're seeing in these images from Hong Kong and Rotterdam, which look very much to each other because that is the function of these 2 areas. Hong Kong and Rotterdam, both their footprint on their origin is because they are entrepôts. Think of some other entrepôts. Does a place begin because it's a railhead, the end of a rail line? We have several of these in the United States. This is the one in North Platte, Nebraska, where the rail lines all come into one point. Cargo is distributed to other rail lines, other trucks, container storage facilities, but we have a railhead as a means of connectivity to other parts of the region of the United States and the distribution of cargo. Lastly, does a place begin because of security and defense? We look at these ancient cities and we have to consider, how did they protect themselves? Why did they protect themselves? Why did they build these large walls? What was that purpose? And this actually is Jerusalem with the old wall around the entire portion of the old city, of which that wall was rebuilt, but in the same location. But if we look at other places that you might be more familiar with, places that are named forts, that cities that begin as Fort Worth, those began as defense operations in older days of the United States when they were protecting certain lands. So, all right, so we have a purpose, and then out of that purpose, we begin to see the growth of cities. And after the growth of cities, we begin to see, we have to ask, why are cities growing so much today? What is causing that? Is this a population birth rate, or is this, once again, a migration rate? So in 2007, we finally had more people living in urban areas in the world than we did in rural areas. And this is what this graph is showing you. Now, graphs, charts, these are one of our skills. This is data analysis, one of our skills that we have in this curriculum. So you want to make sure that you are looking at these kinds of different types of data and looking at them in their graphical perspective, not just as a laundry list of numbers, but you want to look at these and then determine, what can I glean from this type of information? What can I pull out of here? And so this one, which is kind of colorful in its own right, can kind of play games with your eyes. This one is looking at, is showing you that by 2007, more people are living in urban areas than in rural areas. And this is partly contributing to the huge growth of cities. And that leads us actually into the second part of this topic 6.1, and that is, how have cities continued to grow? What has contributed to that? So in this particular section, you have change in transportation, communication, You have population growth itself, migration, development, government policies, and just how government policies influence urbanization. So if we look at the distribution of world populations, and Miss Brandt is going to talk about more of this tomorrow in 6.2, but just to give you a quick overview here, if we look at the distribution of the world's population since 1950 to 2030, we have an interesting pattern here. The darker dots are the largest cities in 1950. The large circles are going to have populations of 20 million. So there's a vocabulary word that goes with that, but it's inherent to urban, so you probably are not going to need to use it, and that's called a mega city. So populations of 20 million, we have some of those in historical times, and going back to 1950, that's probably historical enough for y'all. But if you come forward to 2030, the lightest color blue, look at the pattern that we start to see in this map. Notice that we have not only coastal areas, which is characteristic of place settlements in ancient times, but we have newer areas where we didn't previously have historical settlements. And these newer areas, we start to see a lot of development here in Western Africa, and in South America, even continued more along the bulge of Brazil. But look at India, not just the traditional cities that you may be familiar with in India, but larger ones on their suburban ring, their edge city areas. These are also growing by millions and millions of population, such that when we get to, go on to this slide, when we get to 2030, look at India here. You're looking at 8 cities alone that will be over 10 million in population. Notice West Africa, these cities here will be in 10 million in population. And of course, China, you're probably more familiar with because we've been hearing about that for some time. China, Japan, these cities will all have over 10 million by the time we get to 2030. If you go back in time and look in 1970, notice where those cities were that we had over 10 million at that time. So Japan, New York City, and a couple in India, and that's it. The rest of these are going to be much, much smaller. So we have to begin to ask, well, what contributed to that? When we look at China and India, you get this interesting pattern here. In India, we see that the fastest growing cities are in the south, and there are at least 10 of the largest cities that have roughly doubled in their size in just the last 30 years. Delhi in the north has nearly added 11 million inhabitants in just 30 years. So Delhi, and then this growth here on your western coast is particularly rapid in just the last 30 years. And then your coastal areas of China. And as I said, Ms. Brandt will be talking more about these tomorrow, so I just want to put them out there for you to think about. So what led to the growth of cities? That this is kind of, I want you to have a conceptual nature of this. We don't have to go into intricate detail on this, because these are things that you need to be able to pull out of some of these other units as they apply. So just to give you a little bit of familiarity without a lot of detail. First of all, how did transportation change? Transportation changes as a result of technology. So as technology increases, as we begin to have more connectivity with the rest of the world, that is facilitated by coming up with more efficient ways to connect to other places. So by connecting to other places, we can increase trade, we can increase mobility, and all of that is going to end up increasing the growth of cities. Can you tell what this model might look similar to if we're talking about development? Can anyone say population units and the demographic transition model? That not just because of the 4 stages, but because as you increase in development, you also are going to increase, you're going to change your population. Because remember, the increase in population, as your population increases and your development increases, eventually development acts as a mechanism to cause your population to become healthier and then to decrease your birth rate. So By decreasing your birth rate, your population can still expand, all right, population momentum, but at the same time, development is also fueling the more livability of places. And what goes along with that is increases in transportation abilities and more efficiency, thus increase in trade, increase of connectivity, and the growth of cities in general. So we also look at population growth, which some of that I just said also applies to this. As your population growth continues to increase, we begin to see that another factor is going to play a role in the growth of these cities. So it's not to be more babies being born, it's going to be where populations are. So we go on to migration, which is also part of the population and migration unit, unit 2. These are two really cool maps because they also correspond to some of our skills that you need to be familiar with. So it's always good to look at different kinds of maps and look to see what those maps are telling you to do. And always, always, always read the title, read the legend, read everything around the edges, and then figure out what that is. You ever come across any of my students, they're going to tell you exactly that. Read, she says, read everything around it before I look at the in the middle. So in this top map, what we're looking at here is the migration of populations to new centers. The dark brown is new centers of international migration growth. So where are populations going that are migrating into there, causing those areas to grow and grow and grow? And some of that may surprise you. Look at Eastern Europe. A lot of foreign, meaning outside of these countries, migration is into Eastern Europe. Well, we have to ask why. Inquiring minds want to know why. Why is Eastern Europe becoming a growth area for migration? Any ideas? Anybody? Say it to yourself. Tell the dog. Look at Mexico. Who is migrating into Mexico? Who is migrating into Argentina and coastal Brazil? Migration into India. Look at the western side of India, the same place where the fastest growing cities. Same thing with South Africa, the fastest growing cities. This is a result of migration. Coastal China, migration as well. What kind of migration is this? Did we look over here to the other map? The other map tells you it's rural to urban migration. We have foreign migration, but we also have a large amount of rural to urban migration. So far more people are moving from rural areas into urban areas. And that is causing a growth of the cities. Different kind of pressures on the cities if we're talking about a less developed country or a more developed country. But those pressures come in the development unit and also with urban here. I want to point out this type of map. Anyone know what this kind of map is? Yell it loud so I can hear you. You said a cartogram. Excellent. That is true. This is a cartogram. So hopefully you know how to read a cartogram. That would have been from Unit 1. And it's also this one of our data analysis skills as well, map skills. So in this particular map, what you're looking at is the growth of an area, okay, as a result of migration. But where do we have the largest amounts? And so the areas with the largest amounts are going to have the largest proportion of the size of this designated area or this entire map. So in this case here, India and China, like what I've said in the last two slides, India, China, and the eastern side of Africa, as well as a little bit over in this area, Central America. So this is where we have the largest amount of rural to urban migration. And then you combine that with international migration, all of these folks are going to cities. Why to cities? That's what we have to ask. What is it about the city that we have to consider? So next thing I want you to do is that we are going to look at this short explanation and we're going to make all this work. I know we are. Hold on. All right, so let me go back to this. All right, so that short video was linking development and industrialization with the growth of cities as a factor that will contribute to even larger growth, particularly in India and China and Indonesia over the next 20 years. These links, this particular video, this particular topic, all links to development. And development is an overarching theme through all of our course, all of our units. And then also globalization. And we have to talk a lot about globalization as this theme that carries through and influences so many of our other units. And so globalization and development, fueled by migration, fueled by industrial development, further industrial development, is leading the growth of these cities. And that was a real short little video that I really feel ties Unit 6 and Unit 7 back to why we're looking at that in the overarching understanding of the previous units. Okay, so if we go on, am I going on? Yes. Yes. The other aspect of why cities grow so rapidly is also because of government policies. And this would have been in Unit 4, where you would have touched upon some of the political geography topics and maybe addressed it in urban issues in that particular unit. If not, it is in this, but do understand that political actions at the local scale, as well as the state and national scale, is also to have a factor in the growth of cities. Whatever leads the people to the cities then allows them to live there. If the quality of life is not good, that can manifest itself in greater problems in the city. So governments are trying to interact and improve the quality of life to then improve the industrial development of those cities. And that's causing these cities to become even larger and larger. So this is yet again another one of our skill topic areas where we have to interpret data from a different type of graph. So in this particular graph, who is trying to ensure land, housing, and services are suitable for the urban poor. Those are colored in blue. Who's not doing anything is colored in red. The size of the bubble is proportionate to the urban population. So obviously China and India, Indonesia, Brazil are going to have your largest urban populations. And in these areas, are they addressing the needs of the urban populations? And most of this is targeted at trying to resolve the issues that have developed with squatter settlements, slum dwelling areas, improve that quality of life there so as to improve the quality and the potential of the population. Once again, going back to population and development issues in Unit 2. All right, so to look at these two essential knowledge areas, site and situation influences the origin and function growth of cities, and then how do cities change and continue to grow over time, is the purpose of topic 1 and in this particular unit. So I would like to then propose some questions as AP practice style questions. And this is kind of a challenge because you aren't going to be asked specific urban questions. However, I think I've said enough times through here, as well as I'm pointing it out in these kinds of questions, that urban topics permeate through our other units as an example of the impact of that particular unit. For example, the very first one, what types of government services need to be provided in a city with an increasing old age dependency ratio? Well, old age dependency ratio is something you would have covered in Unit 2. So how am I going to manage a larger population in an urban area that is of a particular age category? What kind of government services need to be held here, need to be conducted or provided? We're seeing some of that issue right now. Identify how urbanization changes traditional cultural practices. Do you lose your culture in large cities? Do you lose those traditional cultural practices? Are there laws that prevent certain cultural practices? I want you to think about that. Think if you can come up with an answer, because Ms. Brandt's going to go over a few of these tomorrow with you, get you to think about them. Pay attention also, and we'll talk about this when we get toward the end of all of these presentations. What do these terms mean for us? What are these terms trying to tell us? All right, then describe what is the relationship between market gardening to large urban areas? What's the relationship of agricultural, sedentary agriculture to the development of urban areas? We have to describe that. Describe one positive or negative effect of rural or urban migration. Okay, so once again, that's unit 2, migration. And where is that migration going to? It's going to the urban area. And then lastly, why site and situation, which is fundamental to understanding a place to begin with, why the site situation of a place influences its role in a globalized world. Once again, globalization is an overarching theme to this entire unit. So in these kinds of questions, I want you, after many of you have had a break for a while here, I want you to start thinking about how this entire course begins to link together, because it does. They build on itself from the beginning until we get to actually unit 6 and 7, which are, you want to kind of think as capstone or culminating units that tie everything together. So think about those questions. You can always go back to the tape, the replay of this tape, and pull those questions back up and look at those. So I just want to say thank you for watching for today. We have quite a few more of these until May 1st to do. In a week or so, we will have some of these key outstanding topics covered between unit 6, which is urban, and 7, which is development. And then we'll also be posting the full schedule of review topics for the remainder of this course. And we plan on going back through each of the units and covering key elements of those units and which topics you might want to prioritize for review. And then also how to tackle the FRQ, the new format we have this year, and particularly addressing the terms that are asking you your 2 words, or your command terms, as I like to call them. So with that, I want you to welcome Kristen Brandt tomorrow from Glenbard West High School in Glen Ellen, Illinois. And she will be with you for topic 6.2 tomorrow. And I hope you have a great evening, and thank you for watching.